It was a lazy Sunday morning when dawn beckoned at December 7th, 1941. Suddenly and unexpectedly, that peace was broken. The skies were filled with swarming Japanese planes. Explosions rocked the harbor. Plumes of black smoke rose everywhere. When the attack had ended, the American forces were ravaged, and World War II had begun for the United States. Hi, I'm Mike Lech, and welcome to Adventures in Scale Modeling, here at Pearl Harbor. That morning at 8:10 a.m., the battleship Arizona was hit with an armor-piercing bomb that slammed to her deck and ignited the forward ammunition compartment. In less than 9 minutes, the USS Arizona sank, taking 1,177 members of the crew with her. It was a devastating loss. Today, the USS Arizona is a designated National Historic Landmark, honoring those brave men who died defending their ship and their country. The entire fleet moored at Pearl Harbor that day was either lost or severely damaged, but the physical damage sustained by the fleet paled in comparison to the loss of human life. When the smoke had cleared, 2,400 were dead and 1,177 were wounded. Today, this Remembrance Memorial, dedicated on the 50th anniversary of the attack, honors those valiant dead, preserving their memory forever. We'll return to Pearl Harbor later on to learn more about its place in history. But first, let's start building our model of the USS Arizona. The Arizona Memorial is a way of honoring those who died in Pearl Harbor. We can also remember historical events through model building. And Mike Fleckenstein is here in the workshop to help us achieve that goal by building a model of the USS Arizona. Now, Mike, we've built many ship models before, and I thought we learned all there was to know. What can you teach us that's new?
Well, most of these ship models are molded in really small scales. For instance, this one of the Arizona is 1/420th scale. And when they mold them in that small scale, the finer parts, such as the ship railings, tend to be a little bit clunky looking.
Yeah, they look a little lumpy. You can't see through them at all.
Right, so there's some things we can do, aftermarket parts, that we can add that will fine detail the appearance of the model.
What did you bring to show us?
Well, those ship railings over there. Bring up the easel.
Yeah, bring up the easel so we can get a good close look at these. And what are these?
These are etched metal ship railings made by an aftermarket company, and they're made by the same procedure that they use to make printed circuit boards, etching and patterns.
Okay, now they seem kind of delicate. Are they easy to work with?
Yeah, well, all we have to do, Mike, is get them off the trees that they come molded on, and that's really simple. You take our hobby knife, and they're attached to the trees by very fine pieces of brass. So all we have to do is cut them off, much like you cut the pieces of plastic off a plastic parts tree.
It's just that simple.
And I believe we have that separated.
A little bit more there, Mike. There you go. Popped off. Two inside of wet.
Now, the next step is to remove the heavy parts that are molded onto the model. And for that, we use these little nippers.
Okay, so we have to remove some material here.
Exactly. Just a matter of clipping it off as we go along and bending it out of the way.
Okay. Now that clipping seems kind of easy, but you're leaving a very rough edge left.
Well, all we have to do now is take our needle file and flatten the area down.
So we're going to remove all of that old railing.
Exactly, and it's fairly easy along the periphery of the ship here, but when you get up into the superstructure and mass, it becomes a little more difficult, but same technique.
Okay.
Once we get that all cleaned up, I prepared an area up at the bow of the ship that we can use to demonstrate how the railings get attached. What we have to do is find a good starting point. So we'll start right at the tip of the bow and hold the railing in place, and take our thumb and forefinger, run it along the railing until it assumes a curve to match that of the hull.
Oh, so you have to force the curve. You just can't just glue it down and go along.
Right, because then the glue probably gets stuck to your fingers and get all messed up. But just start in the beginning and work around it. And each time you'll notice that it gets closer to the curve of the ship.
It's getting much closer.
For instance, that's a little flat right there, so we just got to kind of edge it into shape. Now we're getting pretty close there.
Okay, but as you go along the side of the boat, there's a very severe curve there.
Right, and there's a way around that too, is all we have to do is hold the railing in place at the curve, the bend, and take our tweezers, hold it in place, just give it a sharp end, like so.
Oh, okay.
And now you notice the curve of the hull continues. So we just go back to the old procedure. Hold it again, and start to bend it. And eventually, after a lot of trial and error, we're going to get it to fit exactly right.
Okay, now is it harder to work with a small piece of this or a long piece? It seems like it's flapping all over the place. Should we cut it as we go along?
It's much easier to work with a shorter piece. The important thing is to make the break at one of the upright stanchions, because if you would imagine a real piece of rope, it would not break in the middle without a stanchion. So we need to cut it. We'll just use a hobby knife and cut right along the stanchion point.
Okay, again, it's really easy. You just cut right through it. How'd it come out?
Pretty good.
Okay, now how do we glue the brass railing to our ship?
Well, we'll be using a super type glue because of the dissimilarity of materials, plastic and metal. But we should test fit it first.
Okay.
Take our tweezer, pick up the part, bring it to its location. And that looks pretty good. It matches the curve of the ship.
Okay. Let's go ahead and attach it now.
Use a super glue. Just run a light bead right along the area where the railing is going to go.
Again, dissimilar materials, brass and plastic. The best glue is something like a super glue.
Right. Let's pick up our railings. And
you gotta be careful there. Hold it in place.
set it in place. We give it a couple minutes, it'll be set up and it'll be dry.
Okay, then you just go from there with the other little pieces like that.
Right. Take each section, small section at a time, work your way along the hull until the whole thing's done.
Well, Mike, you've clearly pointed out that small details on a ship this size are very important. So I'm going to ask you to prepare a few more as we head off for Hawaii to learn more about the USS Arizona. With us now is Mr. Bob Chenoweth. Mr. Chenoweth is curator for the USS Arizona Memorial. He saw military action in Vietnam and is a former prisoner of war. He's made Pearl Harbor history his specialty. Bob, welcome to Adventures in Scale Modeling.
Thanks, Mike.
What was the strategy behind the attack on Pearl Harbor?
Well, the Japanese were interested primarily in disabling the American fleet here at Pearl Harbor so that they could carry out their military operations in the Western Pacific. When the Germans invaded Western Europe and occupied France and Holland and threatened Great Britain, it made vulnerable to the Japanese the colonies that they had in the Western Pacific. Japan developed a plan to seize those colonies, to seize the raw materials, to continue their war effort in China, and to provide fuel, primarily oil, for their fleet, to keep their fleet operating. When they planned what they called the Southern Operation, Admiral Yamamoto, who was the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet and the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, decided that the only way that that Western Pacific operation had a chance of succeeding was if the Japanese could, in one blow, knock out the American fleet at Pearl Harbor and keep them from interfering with those operations.
And that was 50 years ago, but how have historians been able to get such a clear understanding of the attack?
Well, I think there's a lot of reasons. One is that there was a great deal of documentation done around the attack because of the investigations that were conducted. A lot of people were interviewed. The American government at the time was interested in affixing responsibility for what had happened, trying to find out what had happened. Today, there are still thousands of people alive who were here on December 7th, and those people are usually very eager to tell their stories. So over the years, people have been able to put together various accounts, individual accounts of what occurred, and there's been over 100 books written on the attack. So there's a great deal that we understand about it, especially from the diplomatic and political points of view, what was going on between Japanese diplomats and their embassies and the American communications and all that sort of thing.
Bob, what impact did this event have on the islands?
Well, immediately Hawaii became the front lines. So martial law was declared that afternoon, and the people of Hawaii felt the direct impact of the war. Unlike what occurred on the mainland, where there was rationing and blackouts along the coast, but here in Hawaii, Hawaii had actually been attacked. So the sense of earnest here was very high. I mean, people took it very seriously. So all the things that we associate with World War II were a reality here in Hawaii. In addition to that, prior to the war, Hawaii was pretty much an isolated paradise that only the rich could afford to to come to. And the war changed the demographics of Hawaii. It introduced large numbers of blue-collar workers who became familiar with Hawaii. At the end of the war, when commercial aviation made it possible for people to come here more cheaply and easily than they had prior to the war, it contributed to Hawaii becoming a major tourist destination.
When we look at Pearl Harbor, is there anything we ever overlook?
I think the main thing that we tend to overlook as Americans is the Japanese point of view. A lot of people nowadays especially ask themselves, well, why would they have attacked the United States? They had absolutely no hope of defeating the United States in a long war. And a lot of Japanese understood that. But still there was a sequence of events that occurred in Japan. The relationship of their government to the military, Japan's sense of itself at the time, and its sense of place in the international community all contributed to Japan's plan to eventually go to war with the United States, or contributed to the elements that created the war. And I think especially because of our relationship with Japan today, it's very useful for us to understand what was going on in Japan at the time, what prompted them to do it. Because a lot of Japanese leaders, a lot of naval leaders especially, who were familiar with the United States, recognized that it was probably not a good idea at all to go to war with the United States.
Why do we study history?
I think primarily we study history in hopes of learning from the mistakes of the past, in trying to not repeat the errors that we made in the past, in hopes of giving our children a better life, perhaps. I think we also are interested in history because, particularly this type of event, because of the high drama associated with it, diplomatic, political, as well as military. And we're curious about what our ancestors did, how they lived their lives, how they solved problems. And I believe that holds a special kinds of fascination for people. There's still a lot of Americans alive that were around during those events, and it changed America. The attack on Pearl Harbor made America a different place. And I think the world we live in today is directly related to the events that occurred here on December 7th. This was sort of the benchmark, if you will.
Museums like the Smithsonian, Bob, use models extensively for exhibit. Here at your own museum, you have several models on display. Outside of that realm of display, do they have any other use?
Models are used to plan exhibits. Oftentimes you can create the exhibit environment in a model form, test out lighting, colors, the arrangement of artifacts, of labels, that sort of thing, and see what works. You can check your flow patterns through the museum, and you can do that all with a scale model and get a pretty good idea of what's going to work and what's not going to work. That's one very important tool that model building can provide. But of course, I think the primary tool for us is that the models become interpretive tools. You can go out and take a look at the Arizona, the way she appears today in the water, but there's no way other than photographs that we can show you what the Arizona looked like at the time she was destroyed, other than the large-scale model that we have in the museum. It gives you a sense of scale. There are people walking around on the decks of the model, so it gives you an idea of how big the ship was, and I think also contributes to people's understanding of the sense of the tragedy, because there were so many lives lost.
Well, Bob, you should know your Pearl Harbor history. Thank you for sharing this.
You're welcome. Thanks.
We're here now with Mr. Dick Fisk. Mr. Fisk is a Pearl Harbor survivor and served on board the USS West Virginia. He also saw action in Iwo Jima. He now serves as volunteer here at the memorial and shares his experience on Pearl Harbor with many of the park visitors. Mr. Fisk, welcome to Adventures in Scale Modeling.
Thank you very much, and I'm very happy to be here.
Dick, the attack on Pearl Harbor, what was the impact on America at that time?
Well, the way we see it is just that it brought the United States together as a family, not as a bunch of different states. It really brought us together as a unit. Before, we were divided in many different ways, the government and the civilians and everything else, but it did bring the United States as a one unit, and I think by this was the way that we were able to win the war.
And you sound as though you're saying the Japanese almost did us a favor by bringing us together, yet you were on board the USS West Virginia. What was it like when those bombs were slamming your ship and the torpedoes were hitting?
Yeah, I'll never forget it. The first torpedoes and bombs that hit my ship, it seemed like my world, as I knew it, as a happy-go-lucky young Marine, just kind of crumbled around him. And we looked around and we saw the tremendous devastation. We couldn't believe it, actually, what was happening. We had to look at one another and says, my God, what's going on? And then it seemed like we all grew up together at one. Just to see your men being blown apart, this was something that's hard to really comprehend. And to see the bombs fall, it was just unreal. It was just, you even have nightmares today about it.
Were you the only member of your family fighting that day at Pearl Harbor?
No, my father was on the Tangiers on the other side of Fort Island, and it was a seaplane tender that took 4 near misses and carried 900,000 gallons of aviation gasoline. My brother was a medic up at Schofield Barracks, so all 3 of us were here.
Did you all make it through?
Yes, we all made it through. Between the 3 of us, we were in 11 battles in the South Pacific, and yet we were survived the whole war.
Today we have the Remembrance Memorial here at Pearl Harbor, and it's very special to you. Why is that?
The reason this is so special is because we started it, Lou Grabinski and myself. You would look at the Arizona and you would see the names just on the Arizona alone. But how about the other 1,400 that were killed here? Where were their names? And there was none. And that's why Lou Grabinski and myself, we started this thing 7 years ago. We raised the first $5,000 for it. And I think this is why we wanted to do it, because we wanted to give those guys a little immortality. Because now, Pearl Harbor is complete. We have all the names and the ships that were sunk here, and the wonderful boys and the heroes that lost their lives December 7th, 1941.
You probably have many memorable experiences being a volunteer, but as a volunteer, what was your most memorable?
One that I can't help but remember, and to this day, this gentleman, this was about a year ago, he came up to me, and it was a Japanese guy my age, and he kept pounding his chest. He says, I'm Japanese, I'm Japanese. And then he put his hands on my shoulder like this, and he says, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry. And then he brought me together, and he started to hug me, and started to cry. And then his wife was approximately about 3 or 4 feet from us, and she was like this, you know, and you could see the tears just roll down her cheeks. And yet, she didn't even participate in what this Japanese gentleman did. So he was my age, and I've had many other experiences similar to that.
Dick, thanks an awful lot for coming out and talking to us about the memorial here at Pearl Harbor.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm very happy to be here, and I hope I've contributed something. Thank you.
As Bob Chenoweth pointed out, models continue to be an important educational tool for museums. And through model building at home, we can learn a lot from the reference material we use for the project we're involved with. Now, Mike, when we left off, you were detailing our ship. What did you learn where to put all those super details?
Before you can do a detailing project this big, you have to have some good references. I brought along several just to show you what I used.
All right, let's see what you have.
And this is a book with basically narratives by people that were there during the attack. And it gives you a good historical background. This is a book that tells you everything you want to know about the Arizona from the day the keel was laid until the day she sunk.
So you learned a lot about the USS Arizona as well as where to put all the details.
Right.
Okay, these are great books. Let me put them aside, and you show us where you're going to be on the modeling project.
Well, next thing we need to do is to drill out all the portholes that are along the side of the ship. As it comes molded in the kit, they're just indented. But using a pin vise, and if we have access to it, a moto tool, we can just drill out those holes. It gives a lot more realistic look.
All right, let's see what you can do.
Take our pin vise and just put it in the indentation where the porthole is and twist it.
It's almost like a starter hole's already there for us.
Exactly. And keep on going through until we make penetration.
So it's a very simple thing we can do to get a nice detail on our ship.
Exactly.
How many times do we have to do this, Mike?
250.
So a little bit of patience is involved here.
Exactly, yeah.
All right, what else can we do?
Well, the same procedure applies to the gun barrels, and there are probably another 250 of them on the ship. And you have one here.
Well, that's really small. Now, how would you start the hole on something like that?
Well, we have to make a little pilot hole. If you don't, the bit on the pin vise will just kind of dance around the surface of the barrel.
Okay, what do you use?
Use our hobby knife and just
We're just going to prick
put
the
in the
front of
center.
that.
Yeah, exactly. A little starter hole.
Not much pressure, just enough to make the hole. All right?
Now again, using our pin vise, put in the starter hole, and start twisting it.
What's nice about the pin vise is it's a very inexpensive tool, accessible to most modelers.
And it's controllable. Sometimes a Dremel tool can move so fast that it might melt the plastic, so you're better off with a pin vise.
Okay, well, these were great tips here. Where do we move on from here?
Well, most ships have their area below the waterline painted a dark red, which is really red oxide paint to prevent rust. But as ships lay in the harbor, they pick up a lot of oil stains and grease and grime on the bottom from the harbor water. And the way we duplicate that on the model is with dark red paint through an airbrush.
Okay, you're going to show us how to simulate that.
Exactly. One of the first things we have to do is, if we looked at our reference photos, we noticed a very narrow line on the model, perhaps 1/8 of an inch wide, that is above the red portion of the lower hull. What I've done to mask off in preparation for that is laid a line of masking tape along the hull. And you can see
Yeah,
that
it's a
I've
very
left
small.
perhaps 1/8 of an inch there.
Okay.
And I've also covered the gray area above that because we don't want to get red paint in that. So let's just cover that back up again.
All right.
And what I'll be doing, starting with a heavier layer of red paint up towards the top near the masking tape, that would be the area that was less exposed to water. As we move down around the hull, we'll put less and less red paint, exposing the black more.
What do we use to apply it? An airbrush, a spray can, a brush, what?
A spray can would never give you enough control over it, so we do have to use an airbrush.
Okay, well, let's get it out here and put it to work.
Every airbrush here is just some regular dark red paint, as close as we can come to a hull type red. And
You want me to hold the ship, or?
actually, Mike, I have to move it around as I
All right.
spray, so it's perhaps it's better if I do it. Let's start at the top. And start covering it.
So this is really the heavier handed portion of the
Exactly.
painting.
Now I'm going to move it around, and as I do so, let's move the airbrush further away from the subject and press lighter until more black shows through. And that's it. Just work your way around the hull like that until you're finished.
Now, would any dry brushing be involved here to bring out any details?
No, not on this, Mike, because again, dry brushing you want to use as the subject gets bigger. Since this isn't such a small scale to start off with, let's leave it like this.
Okay, well, why don't we put this aside and bring in the finished model so you can show us how all these details came together.
Okay, Mike, it's right in the side table over there.
Okay, clear me a space. I'm coming in with it. Okay, here's our finished USS Arizona. And Mike, I want you to point out some of the details that you've applied to this ship.
As you can see, Mike, we've added the etched metal railings all the way around the hull.
They're a dramatic addition because you can see through them, not like the one right out of the box where you can't see anything.
Right, that makes a big addition to the model, to be able to show those fine railings as opposed to the heavy ones. We've also drilled out all the gun barrels.
It seems like such a simple step, but it really adds a lot to the model.
That's right, Mike. Now, I'd like to show you also another significant change, the anchor chains in the bow of the ship. If you looked at your reference material, you'd find out that the kit has them molded in the wrong positions. Now, the kit also has them molded into the plastic. So what I've done to correct that is to shave off the old anchor chains and replace them with model railroad HO scale chains.
So again, it's important to use those reference materials.
Right.
Hey, now let's look at the hull. What can you tell us about the hull and how that differences comes down around the side?
Well, Mike, starting up near the waterline, you can see that it's a bright red, and as we turn it around, it shows more and more shading into black,
Yeah.
represent the grime and the oil. And,
Definitely looks like the ship was definitely in use here.
right. Another thing that we've done is the flag on the stern of the ship. You can see that when it's shown here in a furled position, like it was blowing in the wind, but as it comes in the kit, it's just a flat piece of paper. And what I've done is cut off, gathered the paper, bent it the way I wanted to with a tweezer, and then coated it with white glue. Makes it hold its shape. And then just fasten it onto this flagpole.
I also noticed you added some rigging as well.
Yeah, exactly. This is by no means all the rigging that belongs in the ship, but it's representative of what was there.
And one thing you've been able to show us is that a ship of this size can easily be detailed, and it makes it look a heck of a lot better when we take simple steps like drilling out the cannons and putting on the photo etch parts. You did a fantastic job, Mike. And I know we have a very special place for it upstairs in the museum exhibit. Thanks
Thanks.
for building it for us. Research can improve the accuracy of any model kit. Inaccurate details like the position of our anchor chains can be removed by sanding. Model railroad chain makes the perfect substitution. Other details like the railings can be improved by replacing with etched brass parts, which gives our model a museum quality finish. While the attack on Pearl Harbor was a dramatic blow to the American military, it also served to awaken the sleeping giant. For the Americans, the rallying call, "Remember Pearl Harbor," helped to unite and motivate an entire generation. But today it is here that we remember the devastation of war and those brave men that lost their lives on December 7th, 1941. Well, that's all for now. But join us again next time for more Adventures in Scale Modeling.